Hello, hi. My name's Josh. I'm a independent, if you will, in the gaming industry. Much of my focus these days is working with smaller mobile developers, helping them find partnership opportunities around the world. Focus in the Western market as well as in Asia. So talk to a lot of companies in Korea, China, Japan. So fairly well versed in the mobile messaging platforms in those markets, as well as the new ones in the U.S.
Okay. All right, Jim Ying. I head up the games business at Tango. Been there for 3-4 months now. Prior to that, I was with Agree, heading up the publishing and investments team. Prior to that, I was with 6 Waves for a couple of years, heading up the San Francisco office as well as publishing. And then started out in gaming with Xbox for 4.5 years on the first-party team.
Hi guys, my name is Dennis Yi, and I lead the business development team at Gameville USA. We are the global arm of the game publisher headquartered in Korea, and I'm responsible for going out there and meeting talented developers such as yourselves and sourcing them for the global market. Prior to joining Gameville, I was part of the business development team on the PC side of the gaming business at Nexon America, and prior to that at a smaller free-to-play startup.
Cool. And finally, Chris Tanquary. I actually work at Samsung right now. I've been in mobile gaming for 10 years. Prior to Samsung, I was managing games at Boost Mobile, and then prior to that, Sprint. So yeah. So I guess we'll kick it off real quick. And in terms of format, what I plan to do is we'll go through some questions that we have, and then open it up for you guys to ask questions of the panel for the last 10, 15 minutes. So we'll get started. So the first question I have is, what's behind the recent rise of messaging apps as game distribution platforms? What are the consumer benefits? What are the benefits for publishers? What are the benefits from the messaging apps themselves? You guys.
All right, I'll jump in. So I think a big reason is if you look at some of the challenges in the market, one of the biggest issues for game developers is their ability to find eyeballs and players to play their games. On the flip side, if you look at the messaging apps, because they've been able to just organically gather up such large user bases, and some of those user bases were looking for content, they were naturally playing at games, it naturally seemed to make a match. And I think if you look at the success of Line and Kakao out in Asia in terms of the ability that they've had to really drive games to the top, it's certainly a model that's been very effective. And so similarly, Tango, we're a messaging app that currently has around 220 million users globally. We have content on top of our user base also. And so the big news for us is actually just earlier this week, we announced a $25 million games fund to really get behind the games business on our platform in terms of supporting developers with both distribution on our platform as well as marketing off of it.
Yeah, and I think if we think about the Eastern market, especially in Korea and Japan, as well as China as well, it's fairly mature for the messaging platforms. Very saturated in terms of number of games. I think we just looked up, there's like 550 games on Kakao. So the lifespan of games at this point is getting shorter and shorter. But I think the reality is still for developers to be able to integrate this social platform, be able to reach these hundreds of millions of users fairly efficiently in an ecosystem that is very saturated with content in terms of like Google Play or iTunes. It's still worth it to take that chance to hope that you can see kind of that viral lift and really drive significant revenues without having to invest a significant amount of money. So there's definitely upside there. And again, for the platforms themselves, I think if we think going back to the days of like Facebook games, inherently the platform wasn't necessarily thinking about that from the start, but people like to play games with their friends. They're more likely to play games with their friends. But it's also a very significant revenue opportunity for these platforms. I think they saw right away, knowing what it had worked on Facebook or whatever it might be, that this is incremental revenue that we can get, and it has been incredibly substantial for Kakao, Line. These companies have massive valuations driven by the sort of explosive growth.
So, as Jim and Josh had already mentioned, these messaging apps, they do offer a lot of value. But as the sole developer / publisher on the panel, I'll be offering some counterpoints here and there. I think ultimately the real value that a messaging app brings is dependent on, who you're targeting as a developer, what kind of games you are developing. For example, on Kakao, 90+% of the country uses the messaging app. So that also includes, the moms and dads, the grandparents, little kids. And so for, gaming companies such as Gameville, who has specialized on more of the core demographic with RPGs and strategy games, Kakao may not necessarily be the most effective place to deliver our games, because at the end of the day, messaging apps will also require a developer for another cut of that revenue on top of what Google, Apple, what some of these other platform providers are already taking. So those are some of the things that you would have to take into consideration. And in addition to that, when you're working with additional messaging platforms, it also means that you would have to create, additional builds for your game. And I don't know how many of you have, worked on, creating multiple builds, integrating multiple SDKs, but that all adds up as just additional resources for your teams to put in. So those are also things that you would have to take into consideration before jumping right in.
So what I heard, kind of the common theme is we talked a lot about revenue and incremental users and those kind of things, which makes sense from a publisher standpoint. But what are some of the consumer benefits? Is there a benefit for a consumer getting a game through Kakao Talk relative to Google Play or Apple's App Store? Can you guys elaborate on that?
I think certainly for any messaging app out there, a lot of people were attracted to these messaging apps in the first place because there were places where their friends were at, they're communicating with their family, so inherently there's some sort of connectivity there, similar to people jump on Facebook because their friends are there. What you're able to do then as, let's say, the platform or Lion, Kakao, Tango, is you're able to leverage some of those social hooks, that social graph, when you're integrating the game into your platform. So, example, all the games on Tango leverage the social graph of the messaging app itself, so that what that means is when you're playing the game, if you're sending out an invite, it's not just, let's say, an invite or notification that pops up in the game. It actually pops up within the messaging app itself. And you can then think through, for example, if you're using the messaging app and you're seeing engagement from the game, you're seeing your friends that are playing this game, naturally it's going to lead to higher engagement, higher retention, and then ultimately higher monetization of that game based versus the standalone game. So I think from the consumer's perspective, because they see this added value on the Tango side, what we've seen is that games that have integrated the Tango SDK properly, you actually get a 2 to 3 times lift off of the LTV because of this increased engagement and retention.
Yeah, and I think just for discovery too, I mean, obviously the chart position is incredibly valuable and important in the App Store. So if you're thinking about, hey, I'm looking for new games, inherently if there's games your friends are frictionlessly able to send you invites to, messages, engage you through the chat apps, that's gonna be a significant source of kind of like new content for you, rather than having to, as a user, go out in the store and try and search and find some new stuff, which at this point is usually just dependent on what the chart position is. Again, sending invites, it's already built in. I don't have to send an SMS and then go to the store or send an email or something that's, gets clogged through these other channels. They're already in the Tango app. There's a games, there's directory in the Kakao line for different games. Again, as a channel for discovery that's been curated somewhat, it's pretty valuable for users to, I think, find new content.
Yeah, and I think the social graph element is really the main value proposition that these messaging apps bring. And it's not like these are virtual avatars that you're connecting with. These are your actual friends who you're very close with. You have their mobile numbers. That's why they're on your device and you're connected. So you know what you're doing. You can interact and engage with each other. So I think ultimately that social nature, similar to what Facebook brought to the social gaming market, really does benefit the consumers. The other thing, though, is again, because most of these messaging platforms are, I guess, closed marketplaces, the user base, the consumer, isn't going to be overwhelmed, with thousands of games. These are games that are carefully curated. So as a user coming in and looking at these games, they're more than likely to have this expectation that these are going to be quality games that are more or less, bug-free, that are going to provide, better, higher levels of engagement rather than some random game somewhere in I don't know, in the abyss, I guess.
Yeah, and that's certainly something that from Tango's perspective, we're going to be bringing to the table. As opposed to if you just go onto the App Store and you try to look for games, you don't know whether your friends are playing those games, you don't know the quality level of those games, whereas our team's going to be taking a closely curated approach, maybe launching 2 to 4 games a month so that the consumers, the players on our platform are going to know that, all right, there's been some review process there, it's going to hit a certain quality bar, and the number of games that they're going to be exposed to are already be screened through.
And just another follow-up question. So messaging apps are inherently social. Is there a particular genre that makes more sense in a social app? For instance, is it just social games? Is it just casual games? Will a first-person shooter work?
Yeah, I mean, I think the early successful titles was kind of the very, very casual games. Anipang was one. It's a matching game. I think as the platforms have matured, I think more sort of mid-core, hardcore games are starting to try to consider, leveraging the platform because it is at such a scale. So I think in those genres, guilds, PvP, that kind of stuff, you can play against friends and other players. So I think as these platforms have matured, it's moved towards more sort of traditional game genres, if you will.
Yeah, I think definitely, as Josh said, the early success is casual games where it's easy for those developers to integrate the social graphs of these games. But really, the types of games that I think will be successful on these platforms in the long run are the ones who are going to do a good job of integrating the various social hooks that the platforms allow. And I think to date, because it's been easier for casual games, smaller sizes, nimble to do this, as opposed to some of the more mid-core games, that's been the track record. But again, as Josh mentioned, as long as the team is willing to do a good job of integrating all these elements, some of the most successful mid-core games are so successful because there's a huge level of whether it's clan versus clan engagement or PvP. If you're able to effectively integrate a social messaging platform into that, so for example, if instead of using an external messaging app or a forum to talk to your clanmates, it's actually integrated into the game itself, there's no reason why that value can't be delivered to mid-core games.
I think messaging messaging apps, they have hundreds of millions of users, so you're going to have both hardcore players, mid-core players, casual players. But I think I think it has more value to developers that are creating casual games because, as I mentioned earlier, this user base includes moms and dads, grandmas and grandpas. Generally speaking, when you're talking about a heavier game, a more hardcore game, those players are generally more savvy and they're aware of what those games are, and they always manage to find a way to get their hands on those titles. So we kind of tested out the theory. Earlier this year, we had launched a game called Dragon Blaze on Kakao, and following that, we felt like, hey, you know what? Maybe we can try this on our own. Maybe our user base, and through cross promotions and through proper marketing and user acquisition, we can get off of Kakao in Korea and still find good amount of success. So we tested that theory with a game called Summoner's War, which was developed by our sister company Come To Us. And if you look at the App Annie charts now, top grossing for Google Play, I believe Summoner's War today is now top 8, I believe. So that kind of reinforced our decision to bypass Kakao in Korea. So I think the same thing applies. I think there's more of an opportunity and value for casual games developers, but I think those that are offering more of a deeper experience, they may not necessarily need to take that route.
Cool. So kind of moving on to the metrics side, are you guys seeing anything in terms of monthly active users and those kind of things that you can share with the group? And also, are the installs, are they additive to what developers see in Google Play or the Apple App Store, or are we just cannibalizing the installs that you get? Is it just a different route?
I think from the perspective of Western developers, which there aren't necessarily a ton of Western developers specifically thinking about KakaoTalk or Line, it's going to be, I think, fairly incremental. So these platforms are very strong, as KakaoTalk in Korea, Line in Japan. Although Line is actually I think only an eighth of the users are actually in Japan. There's a lot of strength in Southeast Asia. So I think for Western developers, it's going to be fairly incremental because you aren't really focused on those markets in their sort of day-to-day operations, most likely from key English-speaking markets as going to be their focus. So I think those would be fairly incremental. If you have a game that's working really well, it fits well with the platform wants you to be on there. It sounds like a pretty good opportunity to drive some additional revenue by reaching these users in these sort of markets that aren't your primary focus.
I think at this point, unless your game is truly viral, for the largest games on the platform, they're acquiring most of their users through user acquisition, right? You have a game like Snappy Bird, you have a game like Timberman, where based on the game mechanic, based on its particular time it launches, it manages to blow up based on its virality itself. But if you look at any other game within the top 20 or top 50, it's almost guaranteed that the vast majority of their installs have been acquired. And so from a developer standpoint, the equation and calculus that they should be running is, hey, if I partner with a messaging platform, they're able to deliver these users directly through featuring on the platform or because their social graph allows for increased virality relative to me going out and buying all these users, right? And certainly there's a rev share as part of the deal, but I can almost assure you that the number of users that you get relative to, at the end of the day, the rev share that you're giving out, it's all incremental anyways, right? Because unless you're spending this marketing budget on buying those users, they're not users that you would have gotten otherwise.
I think most of the gains that you'll see will definitely be the user base. But again, I think you have to also take into consideration that these messaging apps themselves are also kind of a niche, right? If you take a look at WhatsApp, it's mostly prevalent in Brazil, for example. WeChat in China, Kakao in Korea, and Line in Japan. So I mean, unless so again, you have to really identify who you're catering your game to, and make your decisions accordingly.
Cool. And Josh kind of alluded to this earlier in his comment, but this is a model that largely started in Asia, and we talked about South Korea is kind of leading, Japan's up there too. Is this something that can work in Western countries?
Yeah, I think definitely. Obviously, Tango has great success in the Western market. You have other chat platforms that don't have games on them that have been very successful. I think there's potentially more fragmentation where you have KakaoTalk in Korea is installed by pretty much every single person there. There's a bit more fragmentation in the West, so that could be a challenge. But I think a lot of it again comes back to the sort of root of the usage. If it's saving on SMS, being able to send messages internationally, that's still very valuable for a large, if not majority portion of the sort of U.S. market, the Western market. I think it hasn't reached the mass adoption, but it could just take a little bit longer. There was certain events, I think in Asia that drove a lot of the adoption of these chat platforms. I think one of them was the natural disaster in Japan that's how Blind was built, and then people were using it for different reasons, and it sort of took off. So I don't think we're at that scale yet, but I think there's definitely significant traction already, and these platforms are continuing to grow, and there's definitely need and utility for them for people in these markets.
I think definitely to touch upon also something that Dennis mentioned before, these chat platforms, many of them have specific user bases, right? So Line is very big in Japan, Kakao is very big in Korea. For Tango, our user base is much more geographically dispersed. We're probably around 30% in North America. The US is our single biggest country, around 40% in North America, in Europe and Africa, and then 20% in Asia. And I think if all that we were doing was promoting the games that we were going to partner on to our platform, I think certainly exactly what Dennis touched upon. To some degree, you're limiting yourself to the platform of the user base of the platform itself. Like that's why, in addition to announcing the fund, which we did earlier this week, we also announced our new publishing strategy, which is in essence not only sharing the players we have on the user base, allowing developers to access our SDK to drive the virality and the retention, but also we're going to be doing marketing outside of the platform. So just like any other tier 1 publisher out there, we're going to be running marketing campaigns for our top games, driving users that aren't Tango users. So really, what we want to do is maximize the potential of our partners' games itself, whether that's on our platform or off.
I'm just gonna have to agree with everything Josh stated. I think, in terms of the adoption rate, I mean, Asia has definitely adopted these messaging apps much more quickly than we have. I think here it's definitely more fragmented. I mean, when you're talking about messaging apps, there's still people that are using, SMS or GChat, or it could be Skype, or a whole variety of things. And I think we're not at the point yet where everybody is on a single, mobile platform. Outside of, I guess we already have, Apple App Store and Google Play already, and people are already going to those stores. But, I don't think we're at that point where everybody's on a single messaging platform to really make a significant impact the way, a Line or a Kakao does in their respective countries.
I think one thing that'll be interesting is to see how, these businesses have obviously been very successful in terms of creating these companies with massive market caps, and they're being very aggressive about expansion into Southeast Asia, India, Europe. So I think with Tango and Line and Kakao and WeChat and there's others sort of secondary players. They're all very aggressive, and they're intelligent enough to know that games are something that engages millions of users globally, and that can be a way to reach and grow their platforms in addition to driving revenue. And so I think that's going to be interesting over the next year or 2 years, or probably actually even shorter time frame, to see how competitive it gets. Because traditionally, a lot of these have been, although Tango is fairly diverse with Kakao and I think Line, they're starting to now duke it out in these other markets and really compete against each other, and also WeChat to expand. And I think these companies have so much money that'll be interesting to see now that they're actually competing with each other, what happens with adoption around the world.
I think Josh mentioned that one of the early drivers for Line adoption was natural disaster. And I think if you also look at the use cases for these messaging apps initially, you can also see why it's driven greater penetration in some other places. So outside of the US, SMS, generally you have to pay for at a much larger scale than in the US, whereas in the US you pay $5 a month and you can send all the text you want. The main driver really outside of the US for a lot of these messaging apps was this payment structure for text. And so if you think about, all right, I have to pay for all these texts relative to downloading something like Line, Kakao, WhatsApp, where I can it's all that I want, that's a significant reason to download that app. Similar to Tango, the way Tango actually started out was it was essentially FaceTime for Android, or FaceTime cross-platform, right? Before there were many other platforms to go out with. And so there was significant Tango adoption from there. And then it's really on top of that. Once you have that user base, once people are engaged with your platform, they're ultimately looking for some content to engage with, right? People are playing games on their own, they're listening to music, they're checking news. If you can deliver that content to them in a place where they already are, and then provide them the opportunity to chat about that content, I think that's really the value proposition that we're looking to deliver on.
Cool. And I know it's a little early, especially in the US market, but where do you see this going in terms of additional functionality, new business models? Do you guys have any thoughts on how this might evolve over the next couple of years?
Yeah, well, I believe it's WeChat. I mean, I think when these things start adding payment, so you can actually have the PayPal functionality and being able to send money to other users. I mean, hopefully that'll eventually happen, because it's not very sort of frictionless at this point on mobile. I think that opens a lot of doors. Users are used to purchasing stuff in-app for games. But I think a lot of especially ones in Asia, are fairly aggressive about diversifying and, getting your Uber or your taxi or buying food or whatever it is, and you paying through these channels and, sending money to other users. I mean, that should be another potential massive bump in adoption. But I think, as Jim said, the key is the more services you offer within your app, the less users have to go to other apps on their device. And that benefits, obviously, the platform, benefits the game developers, as these things will continue to grow and have more utility. Users will spend more time in them.
Yeah, so I think it'll be interesting to see how this all plays out. I mean, already, you have, varying messaging apps offering different services. For us at Gameville, we've both experienced launching games on Kakao as well as Line. Kakao is a bit more straightforward in that you kind of just put it up on a store and, that's it. Whereas, Line acts a little bit more like a publisher themselves, where they offer some additional support for the developers. With some like customer support work or QA work, or similar to as Jim mentioned, Tango is offering similar services, and I think it'll be more competitive in that sense. And so I'm kind of curious to see how it goes. But all of these features, they all initially started out as monetization strategies for the respective companies. So as a developer and a publisher, I'm just looking forward to see what they have coming out.
So Dennis, to put you on the spot a little bit, as a developer, are there additional things that you would like to see? Perhaps additional functionality in the SDK, additional support. Are there things that you're kind of craving for or wanting to see in the next couple of years?
It's really difficult to say because, again, I think for us specifically, one of the biggest challenges is the amount of additional resources that goes into creating a new build for each of these messaging apps. So if there's a way to kind of streamline that, I think that would definitely be helpful.
Yeah, I think it's important for, Dennis is providing a really important perspective. He touched on kind of how they've decided to go, specific to Korea to go on their own. I think, with Tango and Line, the games are very curated. There's, I think, Line is like 50 games. Just like the early days of the Facebook platform, right? I could make a game about, a text game with some pictures from Google Images and suddenly I was making, tens of thousands of dollars a day in advertising revenue because there was all these users in my game. I think the sort of everyone's heard of Kakao, and like see these games making a ton of money, but the reality is it's not as easy as just you put your game on there. Like I put my game on Facebook nowadays, nothing's going to necessarily happen. Like these are very relationship based. How do I get someone that can actually promote my game once it's on the platform, get that initial boost to see that sort of bump to get me to sort of, the scale of users that will drive the revenue that's meaningful. That's more challenging now than if you were the first game on the platform and there was not really much else to play. So I think it is important for these platforms that are closed, potentially more attractive. Obviously, it's more selective, more difficult to get on, but that should be much more sustainable sort of model in the long term versus, as Dennis said, they've decided to kind of go on their own in Korea because they're, the additional work, the revenue share they have to give up, and the potential for success, has sort of somewhat declined.
Yeah, I think certainly, as Dan mentioned, there is additional work that needs to go into the build. The reason really is to leverage the social graph of the platform itself, basically invites, leaderboards, and so forth. But certainly, if the plan is to go on multiple messaging platforms in addition to the standalone game, there is incremental work there. Now, for someone like Tango, because where our model is going to look at pushing the game both on the platform and off, we're essentially looking to sign very close partnerships, potentially exclusives, so that there won't have to be multiple versions of these games out there. We're going to be pushing the one core version of the game.
So, question for you, from a Tango perspective, you mentioned being very exclusive and limiting the games. Are there other things that you're looking to do to kind of distinguish yourself in the market?
So I think the biggest thing really is I think a couple of things. We're continuing to build out the SDK to better leverage our platform. We're building out other tools on the platform to really drive and highlight the high quality games. We just announced a $25 million fund where a significant portion of it is going to be used towards marketing for the games. We're going to have a highly curated portfolio of titles. So the number of games that are going to be exposed to our user base is going to be limited. At the end of the day, our end goal is to get, let's say, several Tango partnered games into the top charts, preferably grossing. And in order to do that, it's about finding the right games, putting the financial resources behind those games, and then allowing them to really access and fully utilize our platform.
All right, how about 15, 20 minutes left? Anybody have any questions?
So what's the business model?
Of course, like every other messaging platform or publisher, it's really on a rev share basis. And the pros for the developers are, unless we're driving an impact, there's not going to be any rev share or benefit to us. At the end of the day, we're looking at this both as an opportunity to deliver content to our user base, but of course also to generate revenue. And so we're dedicating a significant amount to push the gaming business. Clearly looking at Line and Kakao, there's a significant level of success there. If we are able to achieve the level of success that we're hoping for, it's going to be a lot of revenue both for the developer and for Tango.
Yeah, and just generally in the market, you're looking at between revenue share to the developer on the low end, 10%. On the high end, usually around 70%, and that's of net revenue.
Ours is closer to the high end.
Anybody else? Any other questions? Anything you guys want to talk about?
Good question. How many of people out here have some sort of messaging app installed on there? Okay. And do you guys use it to play games? All right, you guys will.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing we can talk about quickly is like, okay, cool, this sounds great. How do I, get on these platforms? So basically, almost all the platforms are closed. So you have to work directly with the sort of business development sourcing folks at each of the different companies, and they are, very selective at this point. So it's not like Facebook where you can just, throw your game up on Canvas and start putting users into the game. They are looking for very specific, genres that change over time as they're interested in different markets. So it can be a bit of a challenge, but I think, again, if you're a Western developer, you have a high-performing title, it's not impossible to get in touch with the folks of these different platforms, show the metrics, show the stats, show that this is a decent title, and then that could potentially accelerate discussions. I think the unfortunate reality is, with specifically thinking about Asia, is with these platforms being located in these markets, majority of content on them is from those local developers from those local markets. You have exceptions like Candy Crush, which is on Kakao and which will be on WeChat, but that's like the sort of 0.1% of the market of developers. But I think if those folks are usually at those conferences, but if you're want to be fairly aggressive, going to China Joy or going to G-Star or whatever the events in those local markets and meeting with the platform holders is going to put you far ahead of just trying to really reach out to their websites or sort of standard channels.
For Tango, when we announced the fund, we actually set up a website landing page. So if you have a game that you think is relevant or you know of someone, definitely submit through the platform. We'll be in touch. We're actively screening for games right now. Yeah.
I think one point I want to add is, so when you're looking at these messaging apps, I think it's very important that you understand the types of services they are offering, right? Again, when you do the math, 30% goes to Apple. On average, what we've seen, it has been about 20% that goes on top of that to the messaging app. So that's already half your revenue, right? So if a messaging app is offering publisher-like services, like what Gameville does, the marketing support, the customer service, the QA, the localization, just getting your games featured, because I mean, if the messaging apps are able to provide similar services, that's definitely an added value. But as a publisher, I'm going to have to say you might as well take that money and work with the publisher, because they have the expertise in operating these games as a service. They have the established user base, the players that can leverage to cross promote, so ultimately, it's a numbers game. There are a lot of parts that take a chunk of the revenue, and so ultimately you're going to have to kind of figure out how you want to move about.
Yeah, one thing I meant to say when I was just talking about how do you get on these platforms is, when I work with my developer partners, and looking for partnerships in those markets, it's actually usually more efficient to try and go to a local publisher who then has a relationship to get you on Kakao or work with Line or potentially WeChat than potentially trying to do it yourself. That can be a much easier opportunity. For example, like Gameville, based in Korea but has folks here. It's easier to get in touch with them in those different companies, and they have those relationships once you're on the platform to actually get promoted and get that sort of distribution push.
We have one question in the audience.
Yeah, so you talked about the fragmentation in the Western market. Can you talk about why there was a fragmentation with the messaging apps, and is that just going to increase, or is it going to consolidate a little bit in the future?
I think, well, in Korea specifically, I think Korea is very trendy. They follow the flavor of the month. There's usually one Korean drama that everybody's watching. There's one Korean band that everybody's following, a certain fashion or a style, right? And I think Kakao benefited from that, and I think a large user base kind of gravitated from that. And at the same time, I mean, it's a small population also. It's a population of 50 million. Whereas here in the U.S. alone, we have 300 million plus, right? So I think, it's just a bigger market and just more diverse and just more difficult.
Yeah, I think any of, whether it's messaging platforms or social platforms like Facebook, where one of the key benefits is the ability to interact with your friends and family, there's a huge social network effect there, where early on, there might be a lot of players out there, but really, once one or two really catch on, those are the ones that are going to aggregate most of the users and capture most of the benefits. And I think whether because the cultural similarity of consumers in Korea or Japan, they trended very quickly towards specific apps. In the US, in Europe, in some other territories, there just hasn't been as much concentration yet. But I believe that at some point it's going to play out where there are going to be a few messaging apps that are the dominant players. And that's why, I think, to some degree, Tango, we're investing aggressively into North America as well as games as an ability to deliver great content to those players.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact that Tango raised like $200 million.
I forgot to mention that. We raised $280 million.
Like, you see the opportunity as it exists, right, is to... you need that explosive growth, right? And you think of like Facebook, MySpace, Friendster, like, it's hard to know what's going to happen, but you need that explosive growth. Feature parity potentially between the products. What's going to differentiate is like what everyone else is using. So that's why these companies are building up these war chests of money and are well capitalized. And the ones in Asia are trying to expand aggressively is like capture market share, and then as long as you get people to keep then using it, they're not going to really, the switching cost is too high. So I mean, I think there will be consolidation, but I think it'll be over a longer time frame in the U.S. just based on, I don't know much less about Korea than but I'd say it's a much more sort of tech savvy sort of ecosystem. Just looking at how they've embraced like online, virtual good purchases and stuff like that, and stuff versus our market here. If I think of my family members and parents and things like that using messaging apps, I can't imagine it, right? But that might change, as there's more adoption and their children and whatever are using it, then suddenly it's critical for them to use as well.
Yeah, but the fact that we have a Facebook, a Google, I think that's a clear indicator that there will be some convergence and there will be a single or a handful that kind of take hold.
Well, okay.
Hi. Do you see a place for HTML5 games within the messaging app Ecosphere?
For sure. So I know I've seen some things, I believe, in China where there is actually games that can be played in the actual chat app like feed. So I'd say yes. I think the reality, though, still, especially in the Western market, is people are just used to native apps, right? But if you can, I think inherently, if you can provide the same level of experience and these people never have to leave the messaging app even better for everyone. I think just again with HTML5, that traditionally the issues was around the experience, and there's so many different devices, and getting everything working at the same level of parity. Thinking back like what Facebook was doing, they just couldn't get it working, and users were just had too high expectations, and they couldn't get the performance to be at the level. So I'd say for sure, I've seen some cool things, but nothing in any of these markets yet that's kind of like reached any sort of level of critical mass.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the promise of HTML5 has always been great. Hey, I can build once and go across any single platform. I can access from any single device. I can make payments. I don't have to give Apple or Google a cut. The challenge is whether it's performance or people just their use habits. As Josh mentioned, people are used to native apps at this point. Tango itself actually has some HTML games in it. I know, for example, Kick also has several HTML5 games on their platform. From a business standpoint, both from a developer and from a platform perspective, is that outside of casino, HTML5 games haven't really, I think, performed or monetized at the same rate as other games. And it really is, it's kind of a snowball effect where most of the developers are building native, and so most of the games that people are playing are native, the games that people are paying for are native. So until I think you really see one or two breakouts come out from the HTML5 side, just from a overall mobile gaming standpoint, it's not going to get all that much pickup, and certainly I don't think from the messaging platform side either.
Okay, thanks. I have some things I'd like to show you, though.
Convince me.